Hey, econ students, it's G here to talk to you about budget deficits and the national debt. Well, what are the effects of budget deficits and national debt? The budget deficit leads to an increase in the amount that the government has to borrow, and as the government borrows more, the national debt increases, which means there are fewer funds available for investing. Well, we need to talk about balancing the budget. The federal budget is the basic tool of fiscal policy. And the budget is made up of two parts: revenue, which is taxes, that's the money coming in, and expenditures, which is what's going out, the spending. When revenues and expenditures equal each other, the budget is balanced. In reality, the federal budget is almost never balanced. It either runs as a surplus, meaning there's extra money left over and you're spending less than you're bringing in, or there's a deficit where we're spending more than we're bringing in via taxes. So over here, we look at this little graph that we have, and it's surplus and deficits. And in which of the years shown on the graph did the budget have a surplus? Well, we see just ticked over in 1960, and then in 2000, we had a surplus, an actual visible surplus. Well, how's money created? And when the government runs a deficit, it can respond by creating money or borrowing money. You can't just go and print a whole bunch of money because then it devalues it. So you have to just borrow it. Creating money helps pay workers' salaries and citizens' benefits, which works for relatively small deficits. But this approach can cause problems like inflation because you've increased the money supply. In some cases, hyperinflation. So the federal government usually responds to a deficit by borrowing money so it can pay its bills. And the government usually borrows money by selling bonds. All right, savings bonds allow people to loan the government small amounts of money, and in return, they earn interest, and the bonds go up to 30 years, and they can cash them back in and make some money off them. Other common forms of government borrowing are treasury bills, treasury notes, and treasury bonds, which we've already talked about in the past. So to whom does the government owe the national debt? Well, when the government borrows money, it goes into debt, and the national debt is the total amount of money the federal government owes to bondholders. Every year there's a budget deficit, and the federal government borrows money to cover it. The national debt increases. So the deficit and debt are two different things. So a deficit is the amount of money the government borrows from one fiscal year, while the debt is the sum of all of the government borrowing before that time, minus the borrowing that had been repaid. So remember, deficit is just borrowed for that year, and debt is calculating all those years together that haven't been paid back yet. So a percentage of GDP. In 2008, the national debt exceeded $9.4 trillion. It continues to grow. And since this number is so large and is difficult to analyze, the size of the national debt is best looked at as a percentage of your gross domestic product over time. And that's a good question. Why does the national debt as a percentage of GDP soar during times of war? Well, that's because we have to borrow more money to produce the things that we need to go to war. Wars are expensive, and output has to increase, and the government is in charge of national defense, and therefore they are in charge of contracting all of the materials and resources needed to fight a war. So problems of a national debt. A national debt reduces the funds available for businesses to invest because in order to sell its bonds, the government must offer a high interest rate. Because in order for people to want it, they want to be able to make money off it. Individuals and businesses thus buy these bonds instead of investing in a private business, which is known as the crowding out effect. There's only so much money to go around, and you buy government bonds, they're pretty secure. But then there's no money to invest in, Joe Schmo's shop down the street, and he can't expand thus he can't hire more employees, so it's crowded out. There's not enough to go around. So the federal government spends more than it takes in and has to borrow money to cover the deficit. Investors trust the U.S. government and loan money to the government by buying bonds, and these are investors in the U.S., but also investors from all around the world. Banks and investors then have less money to lend to private businesses, and private businesses must pay a higher interest rate to borrow the scarce money as a resource at this point, and thus they cannot expand as much. The second problem with the high national debt is that the government must pay interest to the bondholders. Over time, these interest payments have become very large, and the government may pay out this interest and cannot spend this money on other programs such as defense, healthcare, or infrastructure, improving roads and dams and government buildings and power lines and things like that. So it's money that when we're paying these interest payments that we can't use somewhere else. Another possible problem is that the debt may be foreign owned, and some fear that a foreign country may use their bond holdings as a tool to extract favors from the United States, meaning, hey, you owe us all these bonds, but if you do this for us, we can, settle up that debt, those kinds of things, so that, they can use that to benefit them. Some people, like traditional Keynesian economists, believe that the benefit of achieving full productive capacity outweighs the cost and interest on the national debt, saying, you know what, having the economy function at its highest possible production rates, its highest output rates, is so much more important than the cost of the interest that we pay out on national debt. So in the short term, deficit spending may help create jobs and encourage economic growth, but a budget deficit can be an effective tool only if it is temporary. This is not something that can go on long term. So how do you control the deficit? Well, the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act was created. It created automatic across-the-board cuts in federal expenditures if the deficit exceeds a certain amount. So if the deficit hits a certain amount, that means, boom, you have to automatically make these cuts. Many programs, however, were exempt from cuts. But then the Supreme Court found some parts of the act to be unconstitutional, and when something's unconstitutional, it cannot stay in place. It's that checks and balances. In 1990, the Budget Enforcement Act created a pay-as-you-go system that required Congress to raise enough revenue to cover increases in direct spending that would otherwise contribute to the budget deficit, meaning if you're going to increase spending, you have to find a way to pay for it. A constitutional amendment requiring a balanced budget has been suggested, but it has not passed through Congress as of yet, meaning you can't spend more than you bring in. In the late 1990s, the federal government actually ran a surplus, and this surplus was a result of budget procedures that helped control government spending. There were some tax increases under President Clinton, and the economy was generally strong. It was quite prosperous. So that is actually the last time at this point that we've had a surplus. All right, back to deficits. The surplus of the late 1990s was very short-lived, and the end of the stock market boom, the economy started to slow down. A new federal income tax came in, tax cut, and reduced the federal revenue. They weren't bringing in so much money. And then 9/11 happened. And when 9/11 attacks occurred, the economy took a sharp downturn. It actually caused the stock exchange to close for multiple days, which was nearly unheard of since the Great Depression. As a result, the federal government returned to deficit spending, and we remain in deficit spending today. But also we know following the September 11th attacks, we went to war. We've been in war in Afghanistan, Iraq, and we've continued the war on terror. And as we said before, wars are expensive. So let's wrap this up, shall we? First of all, in each fiscal year, the federal budget is either balanced, running a surplus, or running a deficit, meaning they equal each other, we're spending less than we're bringing in, or we're spending more than we're bringing in. Each fiscal year's budget deficit adds to the national debt. All right, deficit is 1 year, national debt is all the years combined. The national debt causes less money to be available for businesses to invest. It burdens the government with interest payments and may make the country more vulnerable to foreign holders of the debt. Since the 1980s, several attempts have been made to control the national debt. So, some causes of a deficit: tax cuts, increased spending that causes expenditures to exceed revenue. The effects of that, national debt increases, fewer funds to invest in private business, large interest payments, foreign ownership of debt. So if we were going to generalize this into one nice sweeping statement, we can say deficits and the national debt can cause problems, but whether they are so serious that laws should be passed to force a balanced budget remains to be undecided. Okay? Once again, deficits in the national debt can cause problems, but whether they are so serious that laws should be passed to force a balanced budget remains undecided. And this debate can continue to go on for years and years. That's all I have for you today.